All right, strap in, everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into a case that's going to stick with you. It's the story of Samuel Little.
Oh yeah, this one is heavy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, just to give you a sense of the scale of this guy confessed to 93 murders,
Ninth thief.
making him the deadliest serial killer in American history.
In U.S. history.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just the scope of his crimes is it's mind-boggling, really.
And what's crazy is just how long he was able to get away with it. Like, how do you commit so many murders over so many years?
Decades.
And yeah, decades, and somehow stay under the radar. It's almost like he was a ghost, just drifting through the cracks of society.
A phantom.
Yeah, a phantom. And that's what we're going to try to unpack today. Who was Samuel Little? What made him tick? And how was he able to evade capture for so long? I mean, we've got a mountain of material here. Confession transcripts, investigative reports, victim testimonies.
It's a lot to sift through.
It is, but it's crucial if we're going to understand this guy, and more importantly, understand the systems that allowed him to operate for so long.
Right, because it's not just about catching the monster, it's about understanding the environment that created the monster.
Exactly. So let's start at the beginning. Samuel Little was born in 1940 in Georgia.
Reynolds, Georgia, to be exact.
But his early life was anything but stable.
Yeah, he was raised mainly by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio.
And from what I've read, his childhood was
Rough. Yeah, poverty, neglect, you name it. The reports paint a pretty grim picture of his formative years.
and it gets even darker when you factor in some of Little's own recollections. He claimed that his fascination with violence, particularly with strangulation.
Strangulation, specifically.
Started when he was just a kid.
Yeah, like really young.
Yeah, I mean, he even described developing I'm hesitant to even use this word, but he described developing a fetish for it at the age of 5.
5. I mean, if that's true, and it's hard to know with someone like Little, but if it's true, it suggests that there was something deeply disturbed about him from a very early age.
Right, almost like this predisposition to violence that was just waiting to be unleashed.
Like a ticking time bomb.
Yeah, and sadly, it wasn't long before that bomb went off. Little's criminal record started when he was a teenager. Petty theft at first, but it quickly escalated.
Assault, attempted rape, fraud, even attacks on law enforcement officers.
It's like he had this complete disregard for authority, for the law, for basic human decency.
And this pattern of escalation, it's a classic hallmark of a budding sociopath. They start small, testing boundaries, and then the crimes get progressively more violent, more brazen.
And according to Little, the ultimate escalation, his first murder, took place in 1970 in Miami, Florida.
The victim was Mary Brosley, a woman he met in a bar. He strangled her and buried her body in a shallow grave.
Just a horrific start to a truly horrifying chapter in his life.
And what's particularly chilling is how he chose his victims. He almost exclusively targeted vulnerable women, often sex workers, drug users, people who were marginalized, living on the fringes of society.
People who were less likely to be missed, or if they were missed, less likely to have their disappearances thoroughly investigated.
Right, and it's a tragic reflection of the societal biases of the time. These women were often seen as disposable, their lives less valuable, their stories less worthy of attention.
And Little, it seems, was acutely aware of this, and he exploited that to his advantage.
Oh, absolutely. He knew that he could prey on these women with relative impunity, knowing that the odds of getting caught were slim.
And it wasn't just his choice of victims, it was also his method. He primarily used strangulation.
Which was, well, it was brutal, but it also left minimal forensic evidence at the time.
Yeah, especially back in the 70s and 80s, before DNA technology was as advanced as it is today.
It was almost like he knew what he was doing, like he'd studied how to kill without leaving a trace.
It's incredibly disturbing.
It is, and what's even more mind-boggling is that despite numerous arrests over the years, Little somehow managed to avoid any serious consequences.
I mean, there were a few close calls, times when he should have been stopped.
Like in 1982, when he was arrested in Mississippi for the murder of Melinda Rose LaPree.
Right, they had evidence linking him to the crime scene, but for some reason, the grand jury didn't indict him.
It's unbelievable.
And then just 2 years later, in 1984, he was acquitted of attempted murder in San Diego, even though the evidence seemed pretty damning.
Yeah, it's like he had this uncanny ability to slip through the cracks, to charm his way out of trouble, to convince people that he wasn't the monster everyone suspected him to be.
And that pattern continued for years. It's like he was living a charmed life, at least from his perspective. But that all changed in 2012 when he was arrested on a relatively minor drug charge in Kentucky.
A drug charge? Of all things.
Yeah, it's almost ironic, isn't it? This guy who had committed such heinous crimes finally brought down by something as mundane as possession of narcotics.
It's like fate was just waiting for the right moment to trip him up.
Yeah, and trip him up it did. Because as part of standard procedure, they ran his DNA, and guess what?
It matched 3 unsolved murders in California.
Bingo.
And that, my friend, is where things really start to get interesting.
Because that seemingly insignificant drug arrest set off a chain reaction that would ultimately expose the true depths of Samuel Little's depravity.
And we're going to dive into all of that in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned.
Buckle up, folks.
Yeah.
The story's just getting started. Welcome back, everyone. We're picking up right where we left off. Samuel Little's in custody, extradited to Los Angeles to face charges for those 3 murders they linked him to, with DNA evidence.
Right, and he ends up getting convicted, sentenced to life in prison.
Seemed like the end of the line for him, right? Justice served.
You'd think so.
Yeah. But turns out that was really just the beginning.
Oh yeah, the story's far from over at this point.
Okay, so set the scene for us. Little's locked up, seemingly done for. What happens next?
Well, enter James Holland. A Texas Ranger had a reputation for being a master interrogator. Like, this guy could get anyone talking.
So what brings him to Samuel Little?
He was actually working on a cold case in Texas and thought Little might have some information, figured it was worth a shot, you know. And Little starts talking, but not just about the Texas case.
About what then?
Everything. Murders, details, spanning decades, states. It was like a floodgate open.
Whoa, hold on. So Little just starts confessing to all these other murders out of the blue.
Pretty much, to Holland at least. And the thing is, he wasn't just giving vague confessions. He was spilling details, names, dates, locations, stuff investigators could actually check.
So they start looking into it.
And it checks out. One after another, his confessions are corroborated. It was insane. Like, he had this twisted photographic memory for every murder he'd committed.
Wow, that's chilling. But why confess at all after all this time? What did he have to gain?
Well, there are a few theories. Some think he was trying to cut a deal, get transferred to a different prison maybe. Others think it was about control, a way to exert power even from behind bars.
To be the center of attention, even if it's for horrific reasons.
Exactly. And then there's the narcissistic element, you know, the need for recognition. Some serial killers crave that notoriety, that infamy. Like, they want the world to know what they've done.
And speaking of wanting the world to know, that brings us to a particularly disturbing aspect of this case. Little's drawings.
Oh yeah, the sketches. That's a whole other rabbit hole.
So fill us in. What's the deal with these drawings?
Well, Holland noticed Little had some artistic talent. So he encouraged him to sketch his victims from memory.
From memory. That's incredibly creepy.
Oh, it is. But it was also a brilliant move on Holland's part. Those sketches, disturbing as they are, became a crucial tool for investigators. They helped them identify victims, connect the dots on cold cases that had gone unsolved for years. Faces that had been forgotten were suddenly given a voice, thanks to Little's twisted artistic ability.
So on the one hand, you have this monster who's committed these unspeakable acts, and on the other hand, he's using his talent to, in a way, help bring some of those acts to light.
It's a bizarre paradox, isn't it? It really makes you question the nature of evil, the duality of human nature.
It does. And it also raises some tough ethical questions. Like, is it right to exploit a killer's knowledge, their memories, even if it means giving them a sense of control, a platform?
Yeah, that's a tough one. There are no easy answers when it comes to dealing with someone like Samuel Little. It's a moral minefield.
But in this case, it seems like the potential for justice, for bringing closure to the families of the victims, outweigh the risks?
I think so too. And it's important to remember that Little's confessions and sketches weren't just about solving past crimes. They were also about preventing future ones.
How so?
By understanding his methods, his patterns, his choice of victims, law enforcement could potentially identify other killers who might be operating with similar MOs.
It's like learning from the darkness, using it to illuminate the hidden corners where predators lurk.
Exactly. So let's dive a little deeper into Little's confessions. Not just for the shock value, but to see if we can glean some insights into how he was able to operate for so long.
Well, let's try to make sense of this madness, if that's even possible. So one of the things that jumps out immediately is his choice of victims.
Oh yeah, that was very deliberate. He almost exclusively targeted women who were marginalized, vulnerable, often living on the fringes of society. Sex workers, drug addicts, homeless women.
People who were less likely to be missed, or if they were missed, less likely to have their disappearances taken seriously.
Exactly. And it was a chillingly effective strategy. He knew that these women were often overlooked, disregarded, their voices silenced, and he exploited that to his advantage.
It's heartbreaking, really. It speaks volumes about the inequalities in our society, how certain groups of people are deemed less worthy, less deserving of protection.
Absolutely. And Little, it seems, was keenly aware of these societal biases and used them to his advantage. It's a sobering reminder that justice isn't always blind, that the system can be manipulated, and that those who are most vulnerable are often the ones who suffer the most.
And it wasn't just societal biases he exploited, it was also the limitations of forensic science at the time.
Oh yeah, back in the 70s and 80s, before DNA technology was as prevalent as it is today, it was a lot easier to get away with murder, especially if you were smart about it.
And Little was smart. He primarily used strangulation, which, as we discussed earlier, left minimal trace evidence.
He was a ghost, drifting from town to town, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake, but rarely leaving behind the kind of evidence that would lead to a quick arrest.
And it worked for decades. He evaded capture, moved from state to state, blended in, preyed on the vulnerable, and vanished before anyone could connect the dots.
It's terrifying to think about, really. The fact that he was able to operate for so long with such impunity, it's a testament to his cunning, his cruelty, and the failures of the system to protect those who needed it most.
And for the families of his victims, the pain was compounded by the lack of answers. The years, sometimes decades, of not knowing what happened to their loved one.
Oh, absolutely. That kind of uncertainty, that lingering doubt, it can eat away at you, consume you. It's a wound that never fully heals.
So, in a way, Little's confessions, horrific as they were, provided a measure of closure for some of those families.
They did. It wasn't the kind of closure anyone wants, but it was closure nonetheless. It confirmed their worst fears, but it also brought an end to the agonizing uncertainty.
And allowed them to finally begin the process of grieving, of seeking justice, of finding some semblance of peace.
And it also underscores the importance of never giving up hope. Even when a case goes cold, even when years turn into decades, there's always a chance that the truth will come to light.
We've covered a lot of ground in this part. We've delved into the depths of Little's confessions, explored the societal and systemic factors that enable him to operate for so long. It's a complex, disturbing story, and one that raises a lot of questions.
Yeah, a lot of unsettling questions about the nature of evil, about the vulnerabilities in our society, about the very systems that are supposed to protect us.
And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll shift our focus to the aftermath of Little's confessions, the ongoing efforts to identify his victims, the impact on families and communities, and the lasting legacy of this monstrous case.
We'll also talk about the ethical dilemmas involved in dealing with a confessed serial killer like Little, and the tough choices that law enforcement faced in trying to extract information from him. It's a conversation that's both challenging and important, and we hope you'll join us for it.
Well, here we are, back for the final chapter in our exploration of Samuel Little.
It's been a heavy one, hasn't it?
No doubt about it. 93 confessed murders. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around.
Yeah, it really makes you question, how much darkness can one person hold? And how can someone like that exist in the world seemingly undetected for so long?
Right, and that's what I keep coming back to, that sense of disbelief. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's shift gears a bit and focus on the aftermath of Little's confessions. What happened once this information came out? How did investigators, how did the families of the victims cope with the enormity of it all?
Yeah, well, for law enforcement, it was like suddenly being handed this massive jigsaw puzzle. You've got all these pieces, but they're scattered, incomplete. Little would give them a name, a location, maybe a vague description, and then it was up to them to connect the dots.
I can only imagine how daunting that must have been, especially considering how many cases we're talking about and the fact that many of these murders happened decades ago.
Oh, absolutely. It was a logistical nightmare, but also an emotional one. You're talking about dozens of lives lost, families left in limbo, and these investigators are tasked with bringing some semblance of closure, some sense of justice.
And speaking of the families, how did they react to finally having some answers after all this time?
It varied, For some, it was relief, finally knowing what happened to their loved one. It's a painful kind of closure, but it's closure nonetheless.
But for others, I imagine it just ripped open old wounds, brought back all that pain and trauma.
Oh, without a doubt. And for some, there's still no resolution. Even with Little's confessions and all the investigative work that's been done, there are still victims out there who haven't been identified.
It's heartbreaking. It really speaks to the lasting impact of Little's crimes, how they continue to ripple outward, even after his capture and confession.
Right. Like, the damage done doesn't just disappear, it lingers, you know? It affects families, communities, and it chips away at that sense of safety and trust that we all rely on.
And it also forces us to look in the mirror as a society and acknowledge that our systems, our safeguards, they're not perfect. Little was able to operate for so long because he knew how to exploit the cracks, the vulnerabilities, the biases that make certain people, certain communities invisible.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. It's not enough to just catch the monsters. We have to address the underlying conditions that allow monsters to flourish in the first place. We have to create a world where everyone feels safe, where everyone's life is valued.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And that brings us to another complex layer of this case, the ethical considerations involved in dealing with a confessed serial killer like Samuel Little.
Oh, yeah, that's a thorny issue.
I mean, he was a wealth of information, but that information came at a price, right?
Yeah.
He often demanded things in return for his cooperation, a transfer to a different prison, special privileges, even specific food. It's like, are you really going to negotiate with evil?
Yeah, I mean, where do you draw the line? It's this moral tightrope walk, trying to balance the potential benefits of gaining information, like solving cold cases and bringing closure to families, against the very real concern of rewarding a monster for his crimes.
It's a tough call, and there are no easy answers.
Yeah.
But in Little's case, it seems like his confessions, as horrific as they were, did lead to some tangible results.
They did. I mean, victims were identified, cold cases were solved, families got some answers. But it's a slippery slope, no doubt about it.
It is, and I think it's crucial that we as a society have these difficult conversations, that we grapple with the ethical dilemmas, and that we prioritize the needs of the victims, their families, and the communities affected by these crimes.
Couldn't agree more. And we need to use this knowledge, this understanding of how Little was able to operate to strengthen our systems, to close the gaps, to make it harder for predators like him to thrive.
It's about prevention, but it's also about accountability. It's about holding ourselves as individuals and as a society responsible for creating a world where everyone can live with dignity and safety.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the dark world of Samuel Little. It's been a heavy journey, but an important one, I think.
I agree. And as we close, I just want to say thank you to everyone for listening, for engaging with this difficult topic. And I encourage you to continue the conversation, to learn from the past, and to work towards a future where such horrors are less likely to occur. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay safe.